Good afternoon or morning, depending on where you're joining us from today. My name is Bill Hubbard. I'm a partner in Thompson Hines Product Liability Litigation and Construction Practice Groups. I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar. This is the first in a series of webinars targeted at issues that businesses face operating in a COVID-19 world. Our next scheduled webinars are May 5th, where we will be discussing insurance considerations, and May 12th, in which we will be discussing force majeure clauses. We are planning additional webinars as topics arise. So to sign up for those webinars or any others, please visit our COVID-19 Task Force page. Before we begin, a few housekeeping items. One, today's program is being recorded, and we will send a link to all attendees within 48 hours of today's presentation. If you have any questions during the webinar, feel free to use the question box located in the control panel on the right side of your screen to submit questions. We will answer as many of the questions as we can at the end of the webinar, and will continue to remain online until 1:15. Until 2:15. We will be offering CLE credit for those lawyers on the call for today's webinar. Please be sure to fill out and return the webinar affirmation form that can be found in the handout section of the control panel located on the right-hand side of your screen. The form provides instructions as to where to send the completed form. You will need a tracking code, which I will announce at the end of the program. In the handout panel, you can also download a copy of the PowerPoint slides and bios of today's speakers. Again, thank you for your interest, and if you have any questions as we go along, please use the question box. I'm delighted to introduce my colleagues that we will be presenting today. Joining us from Cincinnati, Ohio, is Megan Glowacki, a partner in our Labor and Employment Group. From Bend, Oregon, is David Dodge, a principal scientist and board-certified toxicologist and industrial hygienist at Gradient. And from Seattle, Washington, is Dr. Isaac Mohar, a senior toxicologist and risk assessor at Gradient with expertise in drug and chemical toxicology, immunology, and gene therapy. Isaac's postdoctoral studies were in immunology and malaria vaccine development. So we're going to discuss today, I will be framing the issue. Isaac will talk about the science of COVID-19, its vaccine, and other issues. David will be talking about industrial hygiene, best practices, and then Megan will tie everything together with employment issues and best practices to follow in your businesses. So first, framing the issue. As we all know, the coronavirus outbreak started in December, and China informed the World Health Organization of cases of pneumonia detected in Wuhan City. Fast forward to March and April. On March 11, 2020, the WHO declared COVID-19 a global pandemic. As of April 28, COVID-19 has spread to almost all areas of the world, with 2.99 million reported cases and over 207,000 deaths. In response, governments from across the world to states here in the U.S. took action primarily to, as we all know, flatten the curve. The idea is not necessarily to limit the amount of people that eventually get COVID-19, but to slow the rate so as not to overburden hospitals and health systems. To do that, in the United States, various states put in place stay-at-home and shelter-in-place orders. The first to do so were California, Illinois, New York, Connecticut, and New Jersey. They're quickly followed by others, but they are all, each of the states have different orders and they are different. The details of them are different. However, they all follow primarily two kind of forms. One is they permit essential businesses to remain open and define essential businesses and allow people to travel to those, employees to travel to those businesses. Or they define critical infrastructure workers and then permit those workers to travel and the businesses that employ critical infrastructure workers to remain open. Most of them base or adopt the Department of Homeland Security's CISO list, which is a list of various industries which are deemed to be critical infrastructure. And here they are on this slide. On top of that, then, most states, like Ohio and others, added additional businesses and types of industries that also were deemed to be essential. But again, the premise of those orders was that people were to remain at home, and to the extent businesses were not essential, they were to cease operations. Unfortunately, across the states, there is no single standard, and even within the states, some cities had separate standards and counties had separate standards as well. As a result, there was a patchwork of rules that companies attempted to follow and have been following. Importantly, as we get into the potential liability, even for these essential businesses and critical infrastructure companies, they were still required to follow social distancing practices. And enforcement is another issue that has come up in the last couple of weeks. First of all, individual businesses, they themselves assessed whether they were essential. The orders of the states were enforced and interpreted by local law enforcement and local health departments. What they tried to do is persuade and then, if necessary, to prosecute. We've seen some letters that county health departments sent out to manufacturing and other industries within their county health department asking that they close. Eventually, in some cases, there are civil enforcement orders. But in any event, that was kind of the process by which businesses were closed and essential businesses were permitted to stay open. And this is something that was going along on Twitter here in Ohio. This is our governor about the process, and even as Easter came around, businesses were still closed. But now we're shifting gears into a new point where businesses are starting to open. And so as various as the stay-at-home orders are, there's even more variability in the way in which the states are opening. So, for example, on this slide, you can see some of the states have formed pacts. There's a Western States Pact, a Great Lakes area or Midwestern partnership, and the Northeastern states, with the idea that if restaurants, and it makes no sense for restaurants in New York City and bars to stay closed if across the river in Hoboken, New Jersey, they're allowed to be open. So states are trying to coordinate, but they're still very, very different. As you can see, some states never imposed stay-at-home orders. Other states have recently lifted their orders, and they're all taking different positions as they lift their orders. The notable states that are remaining closed for now, California has no set date for reopening. Connecticut is extended through May 20th. New York is extended beyond May 15th. For parts of the state, Governor Cuomo is still coming out with his plan. Illinois is extended through May 30th with modifications, although there's a TRO from a state rep opposing that new stay-at-home order, which is working its way through the courts. Michigan is extended through May 15th, and Pennsylvania through May 8th with opening in phases. But again, the idea is as we return to work, to try to keep people in a way that they are safe, and that so we avoid an increase of COVID-19 rates. And in Ohio, they've come out with Responsible Restart Ohio, where on May 4th, all construction, distribution, and manufacturing businesses can reopen. May 4th, general offices can reopen. And May 12th, consumer, retail, and service businesses. There are requirements to reopening, and Megan will talk about those. But really, all of this leads to claims that we anticipate. And the claims are based primarily on a couple things. One, we anticipate that there will be claims by employees, customers, and contractors that contracted COVID-19 at the business. Either a non-essential business that remained open, or an essential business that did not follow social distancing practices or health recommendations, or a business that reopens and did not follow the recommended social distancing or health recommendations. And in fact, we're already seeing that. There's already lawsuits against Walmart, the cruise line industry, as well as some meatpacking facilities in Missouri. Now, there are some states that are considering statutes to limit a business's liability for COVID-19. Last week, Ohio Lieutenant Governor Houston referenced it in a webinar. He referenced the fact that the Ohio legislature is considering that. He didn't think it was likely, but it's something that they're looking at. Nothing has yet been introduced in Ohio or in any other state that I'm aware of at this time. So with respect to employee claims, it's a state-by-state analysis, but in some states, workers' compensation, to the extent the employee can show that he contracted COVID at the workplace, he may have a workers' compensation claim. Against that, again, that's a state-by-state analysis. To the extent there's a workers' compensation claim, that bars, for the most part, that bars the employee from being able to file a separate lawsuit against the company. However, there is an intentional tort exception to that, where an employee, if he alleges and proves an intentional tort by the employer, the employee can get both workers' compensation and an additional damages through a lawsuit. But however, it's a very high hurdle to prove and even to allege an intentional tort. It requires that the employee's injury or death results from his employer's willful, deliberate, or intentional conduct. What courts often look at to establish that is the omission or removal of a safety feature, or the employer's use of an inexperienced or unequipped employee for a particular job, or other types of evidence that demonstrates the requisite deliberate intention. And so you can see employees may argue that putting them in positions where they're close to one another or where they didn't have the proper PPE, they could argue and allege that that does rise to the level of intentional tort. But again, that is a very high standard. In Ohio, it's required that the employee show an intent to injure another or with the belief that the injury was substantially certain to occur. I'll pass by this quickly, but this just pertains to an incident in Ohio where the court found that the employee got past summary judgment. He could get to a jury on his intentional tort claim. It requires a lot, but in this environment, we think employees will try to show it. This is just to remind us all that, again, like the workers' comp issue, the employee issue is the intentional tort exception is a state-by-state analysis. That then turns to, so again, the importance for workers' comp and intentional tort is that a company be responsible and be reasonable, and that's the same for replying or defending against claims by customers and contractors. Those claims, again, the attempt is to avoid them, and we'll give you tips how to do so. But to the extent they can't be avoided, we want to have things that businesses are doing now so that if they do get to in the future, they can avoid liability. And what will happen is these customers or contractors or even employees will allege negligence, which requires the existence of a duty, that duty was breached, and that breach caused some damages. The big issues here are first causation. This is nothing new. We've defended these cases from Legionnaire's disease to asbestos to other chemicals to mold. There's a good body of law developed on this already. where a plaintiff must prove general causation and specific causation. General causation is that the substance generally can cause the harm. Specific causation is that the substance did specifically cause the harm to this plaintiff. Now here, a lot of the fight will be about specific causation, whether or not the person got COVID-19 at the business as opposed to somewhere else. We expect there will be experts who will testify that more likely than not, this person didn't really go anywhere else, and so more likely than not, he or she got it at the business. What's interesting is that as we ramp up and do contact tracing, that may provide more information as to where people actually got contracted COVID-19 as opposed to your typical mold or Legionnaires' disease or other cases. So that will be an interesting thing as it develops. What we're really talking about here today, though, is duty and breach. A plaintiff will have to prove that the business breached the duty of care. And here that care is what a reasonable, prudent company did in the same industry, in the same geographic area. And so to discuss that, that's really what we're going to focus on the rest of today, is what's reasonable and prudent that companies can do going forward. And so I'm going to turn it over to Isaac, who's going to talk to us first about COVID-19 science so that we all understand where we stand in understanding the science of COVID-19. Isaac?
Thanks, Bill. Can you hear me all right?
Yep, that's great.
Great, thanks. So again, as Bill mentioned, my name is Isaac Mohar. I'm a scientist with Gradient Corporation, and I live in Seattle, Washington. Seattle was one of the first places in the U.S. to have COVID-19 arise, and therefore the public health response was evident here. Also, my wife is a public health nurse, and I have 2 young kids. So I took a pretty early on interest in this virus and tracking it along the way. And for today, I think it's important to note that what we consider to be best practice is going to be anchored in what we currently know about COVID-19. And so that's why we're providing this short overview of some of the science related to COVID-19. Next slide, please. COVID-19 is the disease that it's caused by this coronavirus. It's SARS-CoV-2 is currently the technical name for severe acute respiratory syndrome coronavirus 2. This likely originated from bats, and humans are a new host. This makes it a novel human coronavirus. There are 4 commonly circulating coronaviruses within humans. Those are not novel. And then there are 2 others that are somewhat recent. That would be SARS and then the MERS coronaviruses. And now this would make then the 7th coronavirus that is known to infect humans. As Bill mentioned, it originated in late 2019 in China. And this is an envelope virus. It's quite small in size, about 100 nanometers. That's about 1,000 times smaller than the cross-section of a human hair. Once the virus enters the body, it incubates anywhere from 2 days to 2 weeks before the onset of symptoms. Next slide. The symptoms is called COVID-19 or coronavirus disease 2019, 2019 standing for the year. The most common symptoms, as we've all heard, in some cases there are no symptoms or very mild symptoms. In other cases there's fever, cough, shortness of breath, or gastrointestinal effects. There's also some notion and reports that loss of smell or taste is also a common symptom of being infected with the coronavirus. Within the body, there's a reduced blood oxygen, and that then relates back to the shortness of breath. Some of the risk factors for severe COVID-19 include advanced age. In this case, it's over the age of 65. Clearly, those younger than 65 can be infected and get severe disease. Also, pre-existing cardiovascular disease, obesity, and immunodeficiency are also risk factors for severe COVID-19. Next slide. The virus, SARS-CoV-2, transmits in two main ways. There's direct and indirect transmission. Direct is the person into the air to another person in the form of respiratory droplets from an infected individual where they would cough or sneeze. And these droplets would then contain the virus and enter into the body of an uninfected person. There's reports that the virus may also be able to transmit in the breath, so that would be much smaller than these larger respiratory droplets, though the extent to which this transmission is occurring is unclear at this time. Indirect transmission happens in the form of a person to a surface and then to another person, where an infected person will cough or sneeze and the respiratory droplets may land on a surface, such as a table, a railing, get onto the person's hands, their clothes, or their hair. Next slide, please. Once these droplets land on a surface, the virus will slowly decline in its infectiousness over time, as illustrated in this simple plot. Next slide. Various types of surfaces will be inhospitable to hospitable for the virus, meaning that the duration at which the virus can survive on the surface depends on the chemistry of the virus and many other aspects. Here we have some reports of different surfaces where copper is relatively inhospitable for the virus, and that tends to be true for most viruses on the surface of copper, where less than 8 hours the virus would be largely inactivated. Cardboard is in the middle, about a day before the virus may become inactivated, whereas stainless steel and plastic surfaces seem to be rather good environments for the virus to maintain infectiousness, with reports of it surviving for 3 to 7 days on those types of surfaces. Next slide. However, temperature also impacts this, where cold temperatures below 40 degrees, such as refrigeration, will allow the virus to survive for long periods of time. And it's been reported at more than 14 days under refrigerated conditions, the virus can survive. Whereas elevated temperatures greater than 160 degrees Fahrenheit appears to relatively quickly inactivate the virus within 5 minutes. Next slide, please. This type of information leads to the transmission of the virus. And here we have a simple plot of the sort of an epidemiological curve of virus within a population. The virus transmits from infected individuals to susceptible individuals who move throughout the population. And clearly then this relates to the population density and leads to what's called the reproductive number for an infection, or R naught. The R naught value for this virus in a relatively unconfined transmission model would be 2 to 6, which means 2 to 6 susceptible people could be infected for every 1 infected. Next slide. These public health measures that Bill mentioned earlier on, this R naught value has reduced to approximately 1 or below 1 in China. And clearly then that helps to slow the rate of transmission and flattens the curve epidemiologically and will preserve the hospital capacity. This is largely what has been observed in Seattle, where I live. Next slide, please. Fortunately, the virus can be disinfected and inactivated. So here I review a few of the surface disinfection measures for SARS-CoV-2. As previously mentioned, high heat can inactivate the virus, as do detergents such as hand soap or surfactant-based cleaners like quaternary ammonium cleaners. There's also denaturants that change the protein. The little red clubs on the surface of this virus can be denatured through different measures such as ethanol. If those surface proteins are changed in a way the virus cannot enter into the cell, and therefore the cell does not become infected. So things like ethanol-based hand sanitizer or isopropyl alcohol-based hand sanitizer are effective measures when used appropriately. There are other disinfection solutions such as hydrogen peroxide and bleach. And here I note that the CDC recommendation is 1/3 cup of bleach per gallon of water, and higher concentrations of bleach are unnecessary and could actually lead to poisoning. Here we note that the US EPA List N provides a very comprehensive list of all the disinfectants that EPA has listed as potentially being successful to inactivate or clean surfaces for SARS-CoV-2. Next slide. It's important to note, however, that cleaners are chemicals, and some of these are quite caustic, and it's important that all the directions are followed and chemicals not be mixed. In fact, mixing chemicals can lead to reactions that could severely poison the user. Also, it may actually inactivate the efficacy of the cleaner, and it would not be useful against the virus. Here to note from this slide, January to March of this year, the calls to the U.S. Poison Control Center increased by 20%. So clearly people were using cleaners more, and with that it appeared as though more people have been poisoned. Next slide. Moving on now to a bit of the testing and monitoring that are ongoing in the U.S. Monitoring for symptoms is the most simple way to identify someone who may have COVID-19 and presenting with active symptoms, fever or cough, feeling of being unwell. There's also more laboratory type tests, such as testing for the presence of the virus. This would be using a nasal swab or a lab analysis that would take anywhere from 2 to 4 days. Recently, I've heard that Health Canada has approved a rapid virus test where the results can be available in as short as a couple of hours. However, the availability of all of these tests, as we've all heard, varies tremendously. But looking to the future, we anticipate more and more testing to be available. This type of virus testing would identify all of the active infections. If someone has already experienced the COVID-19 viral infection and has recovered from the virus, you would not expect to detect the virus in their body. However, you may detect the antibodies, and that would be the last test here, that would be present in the blood. And here the antibody-based test would be one that could be done in a clinic and be considered fairly rapid, and you have results within a few minutes. Illustrated on the figure on the right, that's an antibody-based test for influenza. So you see a nice color change in a well. I think similar strip-based methods are being developed for COVID-19. And again, this would identify those previously infected who had an antibody response. Next slide, please. Early on in the outbreak, and then going forward, and perhaps even then within the occupational setting where the numbers of individuals and cases are low, public health measures such as tracing contacts, quarantining exposed, and isolating the infected are useful and effective for containing the virus. Next slide. A number of treatments for SARS-CoV-2 and COVID-19 are in development. Many of these are repurposed drugs, and importantly, none have undergone the testing at this point to prove they're clinically effective and safe for treatments for these for SARS-CoV-2 or COVID-19. The standard of care within the hospital, as I've heard, is oxygen therapy, sometimes repositioning a patient to support their breathing, and then in more extreme situations, mechanical ventilation. There are promising drugs such as antivirals. Remdesivir is one of those that was originally developed by Gilead to treat Ebola. There are now 6 clinical trials underway globally. And then we've also heard controversially hydroxychloroquine, which was originally developed to treat malaria, has also been tested, and the results of those tests are not terribly promising at this point. However, there are still reports that it may be effective in some. Next slide, please. Looking to the future, a lot of hope lies in the development of a very effective vaccine against this virus. There are many clinical trials currently underway. There are 50 trials listed in the National Clinical Trials Database at the time when I prepared these slides. Some of these vaccines are relatively simple, and other ones are much more complicated and new technology. The newer technology would be the lipid nanoparticle-based vaccine that Moderna initiated with the clinical trial here in Seattle in March. Many of these trials, while some have initiated, it is reasonable to expect that the timeline is 18 months, 2 years before they would be approved for the general population. And part of this goes back to the need to show that, one, the vaccine is safe. A lot of those initial studies are going to be done in animals, such as non-human primates. And then once those initial animal studies are done, the study can then move on into humans in very small numbers. And then, as we go forward through that clinical trial process, which takes years, you would then find a vaccine that might be safe and effective. Once an effective vaccine is identified, large vaccination campaigns would need to be conducted in order to achieve herd immunity. And here we've heard a fair bit of talk about this, but these type of vaccination campaigns are typically conducted by WHO. So that's the end of my slides. Now I'm going to transition over to my colleague, Dave Dodge.
Well, thanks, Isaac. Your presentation is a nice segue into mine. As long as that virus is circulating and we don't have an effective treatment or vaccine, employers are going to have to take efforts to minimize exposure in the workplace. And that's what this presentation is all about, the current best practices based on available guidance for controlling worker exposure to the COVID-19 virus. Now, these are meant to be kind of general best practices, and I know every workplace is different, so they're going to vary in how applicable they are. And I'm not really addressing high-risk workplaces like hospitals, which require their own special precautions. Next slide. I want to start by discussing resources. I know that there's a ton of information out there, and I know it can be overwhelming. For the purposes of this, best practices topic that I'm covering, this slide shows the resources that I have found to be most useful, not only for their own content, but for providing links to other content. The first is the CDC, and in particular, they have a guidance page that's directed towards businesses and employers. OSHA has a guidance document that's often referred to. It's called Guidance on Preparing Workplaces for COVID-19. That's a static document from March, but they also have a living web page called COVID-19 that again has the latest news and guidance and links to other resources. And lastly, we have the American Industrial Hygiene Association. They have kind of a clearinghouse type website called the Coronavirus Outbreak Resource Center that provides some of their own content and news and links to other resources. Now, notably, all three of these are US sources. Depending on where your presence is and what your industry is, it may also be worth checking out to see what individual states are saying, or other countries, or international agencies like the World Health Organization, or resources that are designed for or from specific industries. Next slide. So the meat of this presentation is organized along this hierarchy of controls, which is a fundamental framework in the field of industrial hygiene for controlling exposure to any agent, whether it be chemical or biological or physical. And what it does is it categorizes types of exposure controls from most effective to least effective. So we're going to go through each of these levels to see how they may apply to controlling the COVID-19 virus exposure in the workplace. Next slide. So I've combined the first two levels, elimination and substitution, on this slide. That's to either physically remove the hazard or replace it with something safer. Neither are particularly relevant to the COVID-19 virus. We are not going to be eliminating it anytime soon. It's expected to circulate for years, and substituting it with something safer is not really relevant either. What we can do, though, is we can try to keep the source of the virus, which is people, out of the workplace. This means sending sick people home, and perhaps even those that they may have been working in close proximity to. This could also mean testing, which Isaac described. That could be collecting biosamples for analysis or taking temperatures. But as Isaac explained, the status of testing is evolving. Short of us having reliable universal testing, we're going to have to rely on symptoms. Later in the presentation, I'm going to be talking about communication tools and how there's a lot of good infographics out there. And here's one of them from the CDC, simply describing the symptoms of COVID-19. Now, just yesterday, they came out with an expanded list of symptoms, but so far I haven't seen an updated infographic on that. Next slide. Next, we have engineering controls, which are designed to isolate people from the hazard. And they're desirable because they are not wholly dependent upon workers doing things to make them effective. The classic engineering control is ventilation, and this can be effective against airborne transmission of the COVID-19 virus. ASHRAE, which is an HVAC organization, heating, ventilating, and air conditioning, they have guidelines for effectively running an HVAC system to dilute the presence of any virus-containing aerosols in indoor air. Opening windows when the weather allows can also help to serve this purpose. And then an effective component to an HVAC system is to use high-efficiency air filters to capture the virus when it's airborne. Another engineering control has to do with workplace design. Again, all workplaces are different, so this may require some creativity to implement. But the goal is to engineer in distancing and barriers by doing things like rearranging workspaces to create distance, or installing physical barriers between people, like plexiglass between workers on an assembly line. And one of the problems in the hard-hit meatpacking industry is the close proximity of the assembly line processing workers to each other. And OSHA and CDC just came out with some guidance on Sunday that recommended, among other things, installing physical barriers between these workers if feasible. Another workplace design control is to map out paths of employee movement that are unidirectional, so as to minimize people crossing paths. And you may have seen this strategy employed in grocery stores for customers' movements through aisles. Next slide. One back, there we go. The next one is administrative controls, which changes the way people work. This is probably the most relevant type of control for the COVID-19 virus. The reason it's lower in the hierarchy of controls, which less desirable, is it requires workers to do things, and people are often imperfect in compliance. Thus, it requires of the employer constant oversight and encouragement, even for those with the best intentions. For the COVID-19 virus, the relevant administrative controls address distancing and hygiene, and these directly relate to the science of the COVID-19 virus that Isaac described. With distancing, for those who work mainly via computer or phone and can be productive at home, offering this as an option is of course an easy way to achieve distancing. Of course, I realize that's not always feasible. If you build or fix cars, for example, you have to be where the car is. Other distancing controls are to eliminate or reduce face-to-face meetings in favor of technology, and staggering work days and times and lunch and break periods to reduce the number of people in any given place at the same time. Administrative controls to address hygiene include discouraging workers from using the workplaces and the equipment of others, and making sure that appropriate hygiene resources are available in the workplace, such as tissues and hand sanitizer and so forth, and educating and training workers on good hygiene practices, such as cough etiquette, hand washing, and so on. I've also included enhanced cleaning here. these services are often contracted out, but it could be effective to enhance these services, especially to include cleaning and disinfecting of high-touch surfaces like doorknobs and faucet handles and light switches, etc. Next slide. Next, we have PPE, and that is to protect the worker with gear. It's the lowest in the hierarchy because it not only requires the worker to do something, which is to use the gear or equipment, but it requires them to use it correctly. So for an employer, it means continual training and enforcement. For the COVID-19 virus, for most workplaces, we're talking about masks here in terms of PPE. The more effective N95 respirators that we've heard so much about continue to be in short supply and should be reserved for the high-risk workers. Masks are one of those things that serve an example of how things are evolving. CDC initially didn't recommend using masks in public, but now they do. So masks are not effective enough to be considered respirators, but they are better than nothing. They provide some protection against exposure to the user and somewhat better protection against transmitting the virus to others. But because they're not highly effective, they're not meant to be a replacement for social distancing. For some workplaces, the other types of PPE may also be applicable. Next slide. All right, I want to finish with a few words about communication, which could be a part of putting exposure controls into practice. Regular and effective communication with employees is likely a win-win situation. The employees will likely appreciate being informed of the latest relevant updates and information, especially as it pertains to their own work lives. And it can also help to reduce the spread of rumors and information. Now, I've been pleasantly surprised to see a number of well-done infographics out there that are freely available and can be used as communication tools. They can be emailed or they can be printed out and posted in the workplace. So I'll just finish by showing a few examples of these. Next slide. Here's one from OSHA on workplace safety tips. Next slide. Here's another similar one from the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. Next. Here's another one from OSHA that's directed to the manufacturing industry. And OSHA has a whole bunch of these that are directed to other industries as well. Next slide. And lastly, both Isaac and I have mentioned cleaning and disinfecting. And here's an infographic that addresses that very issue. Okay, that's it for me. I will now turn it over to Megan to discuss employment issues.
Great, thanks, David. For everybody who needs a refresher, this is Megan Glowacki. I'm a partner in our labor and employment practice group here at Thompson-Hein. I'm going to finish our discussion today with some important employment issues to consider as employees either migrate back into the workplace or if you're an essential business, as you try to determine what new protocols or regulations you need to be implementing. If we have time, we'll try to answer any questions. I've been monitoring some of the ones that have already been asked, and to the extent I can, I'll try to weave some of those answers into my presentation. Next slide, please. Thank you. So we will touch on in essence, how to handle employees who have been ill prior to reopening, attempting to ensure that employees are not entering the workplace ill, what to do if there's a positive COVID employee or visitor to your workplace, and finally, we'll touch on handling business and personal travel of employees. Thanks, Bill. All right, first, David did an excellent job summarizing the engineering and administrative controls that employers should consider implementing to ensure social distancing in the workplace. I won't rehash those, but will emphasize that beyond considering many of these best practices, employers must become familiar with any state or local orders implemented in the jurisdiction of your workplace and adhere to those orders. For example, as Bill mentioned, yesterday here in Ohio, Governor DeWine issued his phased plan for reopening the state. We anticipate receiving an official order beyond simply some of the website and other graphic materials that were issued yesterday. Beyond some of those mandates, frankly, particularly those mandates are what we're looking for, and to describe how to reopen our businesses. Some of the things in Ohio, for example, that we're still trying to understand whether it's required or recommended, because there's varying language throughout the materials that were provided yesterday in Ohio, or whether employees and clients must or are recommended to wear face coverings at all times. We don't know yet in Ohio what face covering means, and that's particularly concerning when PPE is in short supply. It could simply be a bandana or some other material that's positioned to cover employees and clients or customers' mouth and noses. Some of the other particular Ohio-specific requirements or protocols that were released yesterday include limiting capacity within the workplace, and specifically maximizing capacity at 50% of the fire code. One of the reasons it's important to follow the order is that that gives you the guidelines beyond simply a tweet, beyond simply a website, beyond simply a PDF, graphic display, if you will. It gives us better understanding of exactly what is required of an employer legally. And one of the other issues we're sort of grappling with based on some of the information provided in Ohio yesterday is whether these new protocols apply to employers who have been deemed essential and have been continuing to operate throughout the stay-at-home order, or whether these guidelines are just for non-essential businesses that are returning to the workplace. And so what I'll reiterate here is the important thing to remember is that requirements are going to be different in different states, and it's important to go to the source or the order of that information. And simply relying on best practices in one state is not going to be sufficient, perhaps, in other states. For example, while it's possible that Ohio is going to require employees to wear face coverings, in Georgia, where we do have an official order, for example, face coverings or masks are not required. They are suggested. So as with everything COVID-related, one of the business's substantial challenges is keeping up with these jurisdiction-specific requirements. And so just to finally touch on this slide and what to do from here, I would recommend considering having, if you have not been in the workplace, if you've perhaps been continuing to operate but doing so with most of your employees teleworking or remote working, consider having someone from EH&S or your leadership team do a walkthrough of your site to consider other basic issues. Do we need to remove chairs in the cafeteria or kitchen to force social distancing of employees? If we leave all of the kitchen tables in the cafeteria where they are people going to assume it's okay to sit there? Do conference rooms that people would utilize need to be formally closed or roped off, or signs saying that they shouldn't be in use? Are there other areas within the workplace that employees cannot be more than 6 feet apart while working? Doing a general walkthrough. Next slide, if you could, Bill. And perhaps most importantly, document the steps that you do take to ensure compliance with your particular state order and with other best practices. Like any good employment lawyer will tell you, my motto is document, 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 and then save that documentation. Not just in the event that the local health board or OSHA comes knocking, but in case an employee gets ill and wants to try and blame the company for not creating a safe working environment. If you're going to go through all the trouble of putting in these protocols and best practices, let's be able to utilize them. Next slide. Requiring medical clearance is an issue that comes up a lot. Certainly if an employee has been out of work because they have tested positive for COVID-19, have had symptoms of COVID-19, have been caring for or in close proximity of someone who has COVID-19, you can require that the employee provide medical clearance from a treating physician that it is safe for that employee to return to work. On a day-to-day basis, you can also ask employees and visitors to self-certify that they have been symptom-free, not in close proximity to those who are ill, and that they haven't traveled to a COVID hotspot, which you could define or simply ask where their recent travel plans have been. In fact, in Ohio, part of the reopening protocols appears to require employers to have employees themselves do self-evaluations or daily health assessments that they're fit for duty. And what we've seen that so far to mean is that employees would be taking their own temperature and monitoring for fever and for other symptoms of COVID-19, such as coughing and trouble breathing. Next slide, please. And one step past a self-assessment like that is taking employees' temperatures each day before they enter the premise at work. The EEOC, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, has recently opined that during this pandemic, and even as employees return to work, that taking employee temperatures is, for the time, still permissible. Of course, you need to pay attention to this, as it could change, as this guidance from the EEOC could change as risks from the virus begin to subside. And as referenced before, know your state law. In Georgia, for example, their order has mandated that certain non-critical infrastructure businesses are required to screen employee temperatures daily. And screening and taking employee temperatures or visitor temperatures at work has a lot of issues that gets tied up into it. You know, think through the process of how will we take employees' temperatures? Where will they wait? Let's make sure the waiting line is 6 feet apart. Consider their employee privacy rights of not having their temperature sort of exposed to everybody else. In addition, think through the wage and hour issues associated with employees who are waiting in line and perhaps are non-exempt under the FLSA. It's very possible that such waiting time would be considered compensable under the FLSA, and so all of those issues should be thought through. Next slide, please. And handling signs of illness. You know, as from the onset of the COVID pandemic, employees with temperatures exceeding 100.4 should not be permitted in the workplace. That's either through taking the employee's temperature at work or somebody who calls you before the shift starts to say that they're feeling unwell and therefore need to be sent home. Of course, we know that fever isn't the only symptom of COVID, as was pointed out earlier. So employees with other objective symptoms can and should be sent home as well. If you have not implemented one yet, have a plan in place for the event that an employee is diagnosed with COVID. Some states, including Ohio, appear to be requiring employers now to immediately report employee or customer infections to the local health district. They're encouraging employers to communicate to employees and visitors who were potentially exposed. Under the general employment privacy rules, my recommendation is always to try and protect that employees or visitors' specific privacy. So we're not naming that individual when we're notifying fellow employees and visitors that there was a COVID positive diagnosis. Employers should also work with local officials to help facilitate this contact tracing, which is a phrase I had never heard of until a month ago. In essence, tracking down who that exposed and positive COVID employee was and who they had close physical proximity contact with, and who we need to notify so that other individual can monitor themselves for signs of symptoms or quarantine as necessary. And of course, if there is a positive COVID, have a deep sanitization of the facility or the office occur. And it may be that you need to shut down your facility for a period of time in order to allow this to occur. Next slide, please. All right, non-essential business travel, no surprise to anyone, should continue to be minimized. As was pointed out earlier, continuing to encourage remote meetings to the extent possible. But as we continue to bring business back, as employees continue to uptick and business revamps, there may be travel required. I suggest that employers have a plan ahead of time for the possibility that an employee who is necessary for this essential business travel may refuse. And you'll want to consider how to handle such an occurrence, whether you'll grant that employee an accommodation not to have to perform the business travel, whether there can be any accommodations in terms of having or facilitating the meeting or whatever was supposed to occur there remotely. But do consider that employees will not want to participate in the business travel and how we can react in each specific circumstance. Alternatively, we're fast approaching the summer season. Undoubtedly, your employees have summer vacation plans that they have not yet canceled. Consider establishing now, soon, a policy as to how to handle employees who do, in fact, travel out of state for personal travel plans. At this point, based on the Ohio order that we had in place, which appears to require individuals who travel outside the state to quarantine themselves for 14 days after return, if your state has such a quarantine requirement or even suggestion, you can certainly have a policy or a procedure in place that requires those employees to self-quarantine for 14 days by either teleworking or working remotely, or if that's not possible, quite frankly, not coming into the workplace and having to tack that on to the vacation plans that they were planning to take. This policy doesn't have to be in place forever. It can be flexible and subject to change as states relax their quarantine requirements after travel. But it is something to think about as we go through these summer months, and is undoubtedly an issue that will come up for more than one employee. And it's always my recommendation to have a set policy in place so that people don't feel like they're being treated differently than others. Next slide. I think that wraps up all of our pre-planned slides. I have looked here at my clock now to see that we are exactly at almost 2 p.m. I've tried to answer a fair number of the employment questions that arose. Bill, David, or Isaac, were there any others that you saw that you feel like we'd be able to answer in the 1 minute we have left?
I think so. Isaac, I think one question for you. There's a question about how long the virus can last on clothing.
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and the reports are it will last on clothing for just under 2 days. So 1 day it might still be infectious. By 2 days it was reported to be non-detect. That's not the case for masks, however. It appears as though the fabric on a mask will allow the virus to remain infectious for a longer period.
Okay. And with respect to masks, I don't know if anybody knows, and Megan, this might be an employment question, but at least and I'll caveat this by saying the Ohio order is not out yet. So all the Ohio specific questions I think it reiterates the importance, whatever state you're in or whatever plants or whatever states you've got facilities or plants, you've got to look to those individual particular states and not just look at what the infographics are or what the tweets are, but really look at the orders, because there's things that are being said, and especially references to businesses, types of businesses in the tweets and in the infographics, that when you look at the actual orders, there's more information available in the order. So I would recommend to everybody to look at the actual language of the orders that are out there in each particular state. But as far as face coverings, are typically in an office environment, would an employer be required to provide the face coverings for their folks coming in, or is that something that the employer can ask the employees to bring with them?
Yeah, that's a good question, Bill. I mean, generally speaking, OSHA would say we have a general duty to provide a safe and work environment for that particular environment. And I think it's a bit of an open question as to whether or not OSHA would deem a face mask in an office environment to be required as part of that general duty. If it is required as part of the general duty, it would suggest that an employer does have an obligation or a burden to provide the face masks. As we know, right now, those things, just like cans of Lysol, are in short supply and high demand. It's not problematic from my perspective to allow employees to bring their own face mask if people have sewn one together at home, or if the Ohio order is broad enough that a face covering would be a bandana to allow people to bring that themselves. But I would suggest that it could be that under the order there is an obligation to provide some sort of face covering for employees, and I think you sort of need to figure out by state what the language of that order is to determine whether or not it's required.
Yeah, and I know, for example, in some of the orders there are for retail establishments, it's confusing as to whether the face masks are recommended for customers or whether retail establishments can require people to put face masks on, or they have to require. It's still up in the air in a lot of states, so it's definitely things worth taking a look at.
I would say there is a very good chance that at least a handful, if not more, states will require the employer to provide those as mandatory PPE. If a state has required an employer to do it, then there's a fairly strong argument that means that the employer is responsible for providing that PPE. So to the point that we will continue to reiterate here, check the order, know what it's required in each state.
Right. What about adding? Does anything need to be added to an employee handbook? Are some of the questions we're getting, and also I think some of the questions people are trying to balance privacy concerns, which typically employers have always been nervous about privacy and wanted to protect the privacy of their employees, balancing that privacy with the requirements in some states to identify health departments and things like that. And so are those things that should be updated in the employee handbook? But also, do you think those will change once we're through this? Will we go back to the privacy requirements such that you can no longer take temperatures and require health things like assessments and things like that?
Yeah, so to answer a couple of questions there, I do think that for some of these issues, it's better to have a standalone policy that's written or at least distributed to employees so they're on notice. For example, the last thing we talked about with respect to people who travel out of state lines for personal vacation, or a policy, if you're in Ohio, that requires people to conduct daily health assessments and to notify the employer if, they trigger one of the symptoms of COVID. Those are things I normally wouldn't recommend adding to an employee handbook. Those are just policies that can be implemented and then retracted when we're outside of the pandemic. And that sort of answers or leads into the next question, which is, can we keep doing this ongoing forever? And I would say the answer is really no. The EEOC has, I wouldn't call it an exception, but has opined that we can take employee temperatures because COVID-19 results in a direct threat of harm to employees if it's spread amongst the employee population. At some point, hopefully sooner than later, but who knows when at this point, we will reach a time when when the COVID-19 is not a direct threat anymore. And when it's not a direct threat, we would really recede to the normal inability, frankly, to conduct medical exams, like taking employee temperatures. The Ohio and other state orders will expire, and those mandates or protocols will not be in place anymore. So for those reasons, I think the policies and the practices that are being implemented right now are fluid. They're not intended to be forever, but it is important, sort of to the last issue you raised, Bill. It is not surprising to me ever to hear an employer talk about an employee who objects to an intrusion upon their privacy, such as taking their temperature. So we are balancing right now the requirements from the states to operate, the requirements from OSHA, the best practices we know balanced against employee privacy. So the more things that we can do to ensure or reassure employees that their privacy is being protected to the greatest extent possible, the better. So if when taking an employee's temperature, you can do it in a room where there aren't other employees watching, or if we're not necessarily recording the temperature that's being taken each time, we're just recording if somebody's been over 100.4. Those are the types of things to consider to lessen the intrusion on privacy.
Perfect. Thanks, Megan. For those lawyers out there who are seeking CLE credit for today's program, the tracking code is TH428. Again, capital T, capital H, 428. I think we've addressed most of, if not all, the questions that are not otherwise specific to a particular industry. If anyone has any additional questions, the contact information is in the slides. The slides, to the extent you weren't able to access them through the webinar program, we will be distributing the webinar and the slides within 48 hours. If you are, as we've talked about, this is constantly moving. Things are developing, so if you're not already a subscriber, we invite you to go to Thompson-Hein website to register to receive our mailings. Under the Publications tab, we try to get out alerts as quickly as possible. Thank you all very much for your time. If there's anything we can help you with, please don't hesitate to call. We're all dealing with trying to figure out the best way to balance all of these issues between getting back to business but maintaining everyone's health and safety. So thank you very much for your time. Megan, Isaac, Dave, thanks for your time. And again, if you are interested in any of the follow-on webinar series, please don't hesitate to sign up. Thank you all very, very much for your time, and have a good day.